you've had a really full day. And you've been engaged, and we want certainly that to continue. It won't be hard at all, because our concluding speaker today is one of the stars of the China studies field, one of the greatest living historians of China. And I'm saying this to the live streaming audience, the people who are watching. I usually don't bring notes. I had to bring notes. Professor Frank Dikötter writes books a lot faster than I can even read the titles for. We know that if the Earth has gone around the sun twice, he has a new book out. Okay? This is a pace that people in the social sciences can't match, and people working in history don't understand. He's an incredibly prolific writer who has explored absolutely vital questions, changing the way that the profession thinks about these questions. Let me just highlight some of these. Race, the question of race, the discourse on race. This was his first book. His next book looked at, a much less controversial subject, sex. Sex culture and modernity. Then looked at the question of medical knowledge and birth defects. These are extremely important questions that had not been examined in the way that he did. And we'll talk about that methodology, and he'll talk about his methodology in just a minute. That's what makes his work special. So from there, crime punishment, looking at prisons. Okay, a very, very important topic, especially since we now have an autonomous region that is a prison. Okay, not something that is included in that particular book. How about opium, narcotic culture, and the look at tea and tobacco and then opium, and how these rituals, these cultural, the place that in the culture that these things occupied. Just wonderful, wonderful studies. Things modern, which I read the version that has exotic commodities as the title. Okay. Looking at modernity in material culture. You folks use material culture to teach about these societies. This is a wonderful reference for you. Then, the age of openness, China before Mao, the Republican era, when you had China at its most open, most possibilities. You see some of these. And then he crosses the 1949 divide and starts to explicate for us the history of the People's Republic. 3 volumes in, the People's Trilogy. Chronologically, in terms of when the books came out, his book on the post-Great Leap Forward famine roiled the profession. Still an absolutely mandatory read. Then, looking at the so-called golden decade, which many people talk about the 1950s in a golden way, what title does he have? The Tragedy of Liberation. Maybe not a golden decade. And then, the more recent book, The Cultural Revolution. This tumultuous period. This People's Trilogy is absolutely vital reading. Now, Frank's approach, some of these topics have obviously been much discussed. People have written about them. But Frank's approach is to certainly understand where the profession is, where the government is on these things, their description, but then he puts that aside and he goes to the evidence. That's what makes all of this absolutely essential. It's based on deep archival work. He has paid the price. And because he has paid the price, each of these books explicates these giant questions in a highly personal way. And we haven't actually talked about what he's going to say necessarily, but I think empathy is going to loom large in the discussion. From Frank's work, we can go there. The past, it is said, is a foreign country, but Frank makes it accessible. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Frank Dikötter.
Me. Thank you. You are a very generous man indeed. Thank you so much. I can explain the methodology in, I think, roughly 30 seconds. I read stuff. I like an evidence-driven approach as opposed to a theory-driven approach. And the more evidence I gather, the more complicated it becomes, so I read even more. That's all there is to it, really. Now, I have good news and bad news. The good news is I'm not really, or the bad news, I guess, would be that I'm not really the scholar that I possibly was some 10, 20 years ago. Now I'm just a glorified storyteller. The good news is I'll pick the 4 last books I did and try to summarize them in roughly 30, 35 minutes. I call this talk the China story. It's about the China story. I'll start with a joke. Marxists, it's an old communist joke. Marxists are very good at seeing the future, but they find it much more difficult to predict the past. It keeps on changing. It's being rewritten. People vanish, people we knew quite well. Entire events are whitewashed. So you have to pay attention. The reason for that is quite clear. Communist leaders are not elected at the ballot box. So they have to invoke broad historical forces to justify their rule. Nonetheless, despite the fact that the past changes so much, I think there is something that I refer to as the China story that has been propagated for at least 1, 2, 3 decades. And it's a very dominant story. It comes from the publicity department in Beijing, and it's a story that all too often is taken on board even by very good qualified historians in this country and elsewhere. Now, the China story goes a little bit like this. Anything before 1949, when the red flag went up over the Forbidden City, was nothing but misery and humiliation as forces of imperialism and feudalism crushed the Chinese people. They had to wait all the way till 1949 for liberation. Then, for 3 decades, under Mao, there is a period of transition with magnificent achievements and a few issues here and there. And then, after the chairman dies in 1976, he's built up a legacy for the key turning point in the China story, which is the advent of Deng Xiaoping, architect of modern economic reforms. It is he who manages to change that country into a world superpower. That's the story. So what I would like to do in about 30 minutes is examine 3 periods in that China story. The first half of the 20th century that corresponds very roughly to the Republican era. Then I would like to go over the Mao decades, roughly 3 of them. and then look at the last 4 decades, the era of so-called reform and opening up. And then we will see that between the China story that is suggested by its proponents in Beijing and elsewhere, and my own interpretation, there's a certain, shall we say, a gap in understanding. Now let's start with the first half of the 20th century. I call it a golden age of openness, and that's precisely what it was. Of course, the communist regime from its very foundation onwards, 1921, portrays the nationalists, and later on, after 1949, the entire Republican era as one of involution, poverty, misery, imperialism. But it is far from it. Let me give you an anecdote. 1919, there are some 350,000 foreigners who reside in the Republic of China. Now fast forward to the very end of the 20th century, 1997, there are a mere 300,000 foreigners resident in the People's Republic of China after 20 years of opening up. Today, it is more, it's roughly 600,000, less than 0.1% of the entire population. It is a closed country. If you were to go to North Korea, your chances of meeting foreigners resident in North Korea are twice as high. It's 0.2%. Japan is 1.6%. What does it indicate? It indicates that the moment the empire collapsed in 1911, the Republic of China opened up. People, goods, ideas could circulate like never before, either under empire or later on under the Communist Party. We tend to forget that when the empire collapsed in 1911, China became the first republic in Asia. 40 million people voted for a national assembly. That's 10% of the population, a level of representation not achieved by Japan till 1928 or by India till 1935. And not just participatory politics, but immediately as the ban on publication is lifted with the fall of the empire, within less than a decade, some 1,000 newspapers appear in a dozen languages. Of course, freedom of speech was all relative. Occasionally, journalists did get intimidated, occasionally shot. But you have to put that in a global context. How free were journalists in Germany, Italy, Portugal, Spain in the 1930s, not to mention the Soviet Union. The Dagongbao, largest newspaper in China in the years up till 1949, frequently criticized Chiang Kai-shek, head of the Nationalist Party. People defended their freedom to speak with relish. And not just, of course, newspapers and magazines and other publications, but people organized. There was no right of assembly under the emperor. But after 1911, societies appear. Big, large, imposing ones. Independent chambers of commerce. Informal student societies. Civic organizations. Charitable ones. The whole civic landscape of the Republican era opens up as people participate. People of all walks of life participate in civil life. Elections are held, again, not just in the early years of the Republic, but from 1929 onwards, there are elections at village level. And then a few years later, again, elections are held for a national people's convention. A national assembly in 1948 convenes and is at that point the largest democratic representative body on planet Earth. Extraordinary. We have forgotten about this. We've forgotten that the Republic of China was a beacon of democracy for many other Asian countries. We have forgotten that after the Second World War, P.C. Zhang, a lawyer, was the vice chairman of the United Nations Commission in charge of drafting the Convention on Human Rights. We've forgotten all of that. We've forgotten that people, after the collapse of the empire, traveled in and out of China. Tens of thousands of students went to pursue every field of inquiry abroad, in Japan, Europe, United States. Every letter of the alphabet, from A in avionics all the way down to zoology. Many of them became experts in their own fields at the International Court of Justice in The Hague, capital of the country where I was born. There were several Chinese judges on that Court of Justice. But not just privileged people who could travel abroad. Ordinary people would get onto a steamer from Shanghai or Hong Kong, spend a few years abroad, and come back with a whole different view of the world. And even those who couldn't travel far inside the country, away from those big cities, Tianjin, Shanghai, Guangzhou, were informed about the world outside by illustrated magazines, radio programs that kept them informed about the latest agricultural techniques or the fluctuating price of silk on the international market. Now, we don't have time to talk about the economy, but again, what is so remarkable is that from 1870, roughly, all the way till 1930, after the Wall Street crash, the economy wasn't inhibited, but grew at great pace, helped by that great openness of the Republican era. Now, let me stop talking about what I refer to as the age of openness, and let's move to the second part of the talk, which is on the era under Mao. The Second World War, of course, was atrocious in China, as it was in Europe and elsewhere. But Europe benefited from American help in the shape of the Marshall Plan. The Americans not only gave very little to the Republic of China, but pretty much abandoned Chiang Kai-shek. So what happens from 1945 to 1949 is very much a brutal civil war that claims hundreds of thousands of victims. The Red Army under Stalin marches all the way to Berlin in 1945 and occupies half of Europe. The Soviet army does exactly the same thing in Asia. They go all the way up to the 38th parallel in Korea, and they wait patiently for the Americans to arrive. On their way, they take all of Manchuria, that industrial heartland of China, to the north of the Great Wall, and they occupy it for months on end. They allow Mao and his ragtag army of guerrilla fighters to occupy the countryside, and over the years they helped them transform his men into a formidable fighting machine, while Chiang Kai-shek is prohibited by the Americans from acquiring new weaponry. By 1948, the communists are ready to start encircling, besieging large cities. They blockade Changchun, a large city in the middle of the Manchurian plains, for 5 months, not allowing any civilians to leave the city or food to enter. The human cost is about 160,000 ordinary people who starve to death. Other cities are blockaded, fearful of undergoing the same fate. Other cities surrender one after the other. Like dominoes, these cities fall. By the end of 1949, Chiang Kai-shek and his Nationalist Party have gone to Taiwan. They were fighting an enemy that even the Americans couldn't defeat a year or two later in Korea. So 1949 is not so much a liberation as the result of a bloody military conquest. That's the key point. What happens with liberation in the countryside, it is followed almost immediately by land reform. It sounds good, land reform, but it wasn't really about the land. Villages already possessed the land. It was about forcing a majority of villagers to target and eliminate a carefully targeted minority of people denounced by the party as landlords, tyrants, traitors. It was a pact between the poor and the party signed in blood. As these targets were denounced, humiliated, beaten, stripped of their assets, sometimes killed by hundreds of villagers in so-called struggle sessions. Villagers who refused to participate were denounced in turn. An estimated 2 million people were physically liquidated, many more stigmatized for life as class exploiters and enemies of the people. Their assets distributed to the majority, in effect implicating almost everyone in the dispossession and murder of these targets of the Communist Party. In effect, that was the revolution, the elimination of leaders by the villagers themselves. Soon afterwards, Mao, in October 1950, launches a great terror, the purpose being to eliminate all those who stand in the path of revolution, counter-revolutionaries, bandits, spies, you name it. How many? Well, this is a communist country now, and in communist countries, quotas matter a great deal. So Mao hands down a killing quota of 1 per 1,000, but before you know it, in some regions, double that number are killed. People are forced to submit to people's tribunals in stadiums where they are killed in public. But many others are taken far away from the public eye, deep inside forests, along rivers, alone or in batches, and eliminated. In parts of the country, entire villages are razed to the ground. Sometimes children, as young as 6, are accused of spying for the Nationalist Party, tortured and killed. This happened in hundreds of cases in the province right next to Hong Kong, where I work and teach, namely Guangdong province. But the revolution wasn't only about violence. It was also about fear and intimidation, the trusted companions of violence. People in cities were asked to transform themselves into what the communists refer to as new people. They had to go to school, in offices, workshops, universities. Adults had to go back to school. They had to learn the right answers, the right slogans. They had to examine their own past, denounce family members, show the appropriate behavior. And besides fear and intimidation, hope was all important in liberation. Mao, like Lenin and the Bolsheviks before 1949, had promised disaffected groups what they wanted most. Mao had promised independence to ethnic minorities like the Tibetans, land, more land for the farmers, freedom for intellectuals, property, private property, protection of private property for entrepreneurs, and of course better living standards for all. Well, the revolution then also becomes a story of promises made and promises broken. One after the other, different groups are targeted by the regime. After that Great Terror from October 1950 to October 51, former government employees who had been promised job stability by the regime in 1949 are taken to task in the campaign against corruption. Then the business community is brought to heel. In 1956, all private enterprises are nationalized. Whether it's a small little shop run by a family or a big industrial plant, all these owners have to hand over their assets to the state. The land, redistributed to farmers only a few years earlier, is now collectivized. Villages lose their freedom of movement, must stay in the same place, produce grain, which they must sell to the state at state-mandated prices. In 1958, Mao goes further with the countryside and forces people to join massive people's communes by turning every man, every woman in the countryside into a foot soldier in a giant army to be deployed day and night. Mao thinks he can transform the economy at long last and catapult his country past his competitors, including the Soviet Union. He thinks the people's communes are the golden bridge to communism and plenty for all. But it backfires badly. Tens of millions of people, in effect, reduced to the status of bonded servants, are beaten, worked, starved to death. By 1962, as the Great Leap Forward comes to an end, Mao is concerned about his standing among his colleagues. The Great Leap Forward doesn't look good. His answer is to launch a cultural revolution. The Cultural Revolution, in effect, is about culture. It is about eliminating remnants of feudal, superstitious, bourgeois, capitalist culture that somehow prevent the spread of pure communist ideology. But of course, Mao also uses the Cultural Revolution to harass party members, including long-standing comrades in arms. He doesn't know who opposes him. Let the people find out. Young students turn themselves into Red Guards and start denouncing party members for secretly opposing the chairman and secretly pursuing a capitalist road. But before you know it, these Red Guards become divided. They start fighting each other in the streets with semi-automatic weapons, all of them convinced that they are speaking in the name of Chairman Mao. 1968, the army intervenes as the country descends into chaos. From 68 to 71, they turn China into a garrison state with soldiers overseeing schools, factories, government offices. The first thing the army does is send millions of people to the countryside to be re-educated, quote unquote, by the peasants, including all those students who became Red Guards and took Mao at his word. Purges follow, sometimes targeting 1 in 50 people. But of course, Mao is wary of the army that acquires so much clout during these years. In particular, Lin Biao, the one who collaborated so much in launching the Cultural Revolution. Lin Biao dies in a mysterious accident, plane accident, in September 1971. This is the end of an era. The army, in turn, is purged. Soldiers return to the barracks. A new phase starts. But by now, just about everyone is exhausted of 20 years of revolutionary frenzy. In the countryside in particular, the Great Leap Forward destroyed the credibility of the Communist Party, but the Cultural Revolution undermines its organization. Villagers realize that by allowing ordinary people to attack the Communist Party of China, there's nobody left to look after them. Villagers, in their millions, start very quietly reverting to their traditional ways. They take back the land. They take back their tools. They open underground factories. They go to black markets. I call it a silent revolution, without overt ideology, without overt leaders, without any confrontation of any type. A very quiet, insidious way of wrenching basic economic freedoms back from the state after 20, 30 years of disaster. Even before Mao dies in 1976, large parts of the countryside have already moved away from collectivization. Deng Xiaoping is not pleased, tries to force these villagers to go back to the people's communes, but is smart enough to realize that he doesn't have the clout to do it. He goes along with the flow. In 1982, the people's communes vanish. This is where I start part 3, the last 40 years. Reform and opening up, quote unquote. What have I said so far? Well, the China story tells us that Deng Xiaoping is the great architect of modern economic reform. But I'm telling you that the true architects of economic reform were the people, not the party. They managed to wrench basic economic freedoms from the state, which were then allowed by the party. The party stepped back, allowed them to get on with it. Growth appears in the countryside as millions of villagers become entrepreneurs throughout the 1980s. The party uses economic growth to rebuild itself. Its party has been badly battered by the Cultural Revolution. They rebuild itself. However, while basic economic freedoms are granted, the party, as a result of the Cultural Revolution, is more determined than ever not to share its monopoly on power. It will ruthlessly repress any demands for political freedom. There are many twists and turns in this story, not to mention the massacre around Tiananmen Square in June 1989. But despite all the restrictions on very basic political freedoms, people manage to thrive more or less. Entrepreneurial guile managed to produce what the China story actually acclaims as an economic miracle. So one might wonder, was it truly a miracle? Well, it's not for me to say. I'm not an economist. And one would have to be able to read far more in the archives than is possible right now. But the International Monetary Fund has a number of figures. In 1980, as economic reform has barely started, the gross national product per capita in China ranks at number 126. It takes a decade to improve by 5 ranks. By 1999, after 2 decades of economic reform, it still stands there at number 117. And then barely moves forward to 2007. But what then happens truly is quite exceptional. By 2015, China manages to become number 76. So it really jumps from 2007 onwards. So quite clearly, there's a country that has been able not only to resist the 2008 crisis, but to thrive. I think anyone who's been to China 20, 30 years ago will find it very difficult to recognize. I myself spent a lot of time in provincial capitals reading archives. It used to look quite dire 10, 15 years ago. But now we have beautiful, brand new airports, beautiful railway stations, beautiful highways with roses planted everywhere. My dear mother was a good gardener. I'm not. It was very clear that planting roses is not so easy. But it's not an issue, for instance, in Nanjing, all the way from the airport to the provincial archives. You will be driven on this magnificent highway past beds of roses. It seems to be better than the United States, better than Switzerland, where I grew up. Extraordinary. But if you start scratching that glimmering surface, the very iron underpinnings of the one-party state are still there. In fact, it seems as if none of these institutions have changed at all. Take the China story, propagated by the Propaganda Bureau. Well, it's still called the Propaganda Bureau, except in English it's now translated as the Publicity Department. It's got a nicer ring to it. Now, 宣传部 sounds nasty. Publicity sounds better. They were the ones who have been promoting this China story, in fact, from 49 onwards. And then there's the Bureau of Statistics. They acclaimed the Great Leap Forward as a miracle and now produce numbers on demand to support the China story. There is the massive Ministry of Security and then the Ministry of State Security. How many ministries do you need? They reach all the way down to every single household. More so in some regions than in others. I mean, you're probably better off in Shanghai than in say, Tibet, not to mention Xinjiang. And what about the organization department? Who's ever heard of an organization department? Well, every expert of communist history knows what an organization department is. It's the one that makes sure that there's a party secretary that mirrors every government employee. I teach in Hong Kong. Scholars decide who teaches what kind of research we do, who we invite. If I were based across the border in the People's Republic of China, a party secretary would define what we teach, who gets promoted, what we research. Chances are I would probably get the boot. So let us pray that Hong Kong can maintain some independence. And then, of course, one of the largest organizations of all, the People's Liberation Army. Now, the People's Republic, anything that says people generally means that it belongs to the party. And indeed, the People's Liberation Army is the instrument of the party to enforce its will. Mao, after 49, managed within a few years to eliminate all organizations outside of the organization of the party itself. To this very day, the party is in a very good position to exploit the riches of the country and the assets of the people. Sometimes economists wonder why it is that consumption levels are so low. Well, that's because none of the wealth trickles down to the majority of people. The wealth is controlled by the state and flows to the party. You will remember what I said about the Republican era. There was judicial independence, there was rule of law, there was a Supreme Court was independent, but not since 49. There is no separation of powers. Deng Xiaoping made that very clear in 1979, that there will be no separation of powers here. In fact, it means that there's nobody there to safeguard your own property. Billionaires exist, but they occasionally vanish. Now you switch on TV, and you realize all their assets now belong to the state. And a few others scramble to prove their loyalty to the party. The land belongs to the state. The banks belong to the state. Industry belongs to the state. Most major enterprises belong to the state directly or indirectly. That's where we are. Now, let me finish by saying that one might very well have an argument that says that a one-party state can do things that no democracy could achieve. For instance, maintain stability during a period of financial instability. That's certain. I don't think there's any argument about it. If you have the savings of ordinary people at your disposal, you can build a lot in terms of railways and new airports. Just imagine if Trump could access your savings. The mind boggles. What would the man do? So you can have that argument, but to think that the Communist Party of China will undertake meaningful economic or political reform, I think, is to really forget history and just follow the China story propagated by the publicity department. Thank you.
Friends, so Frank said, I was a scholar, now I'm a storyteller. Can he tell a story? And so you have this entire apparatus, the propaganda department, putting forward one narrative. And you've gotten just now, just half hour, a different narrative. Different at every turn. What are you to do with that? We'll come back to that question. But before we get to that question, I hope you don't mind if I raise a couple of issues. Not issues, but rather questions. One of the points that Frank made about the openness of the pre-49 period, especially the 19-teens, 1920s, before invasion and everything else, was the number of foreigners in the country. And as somebody who lived in China in the early 1980s and had, in 1984, on the 35th anniversary of the People's Republic, they gathered probably 2/3 of all the foreigners in the country for dinner at the Great Hall of the People. And I was, because I was a foreigner, I was included. And Zhao Ziyang told us that there were 3,000 foreigners in the entire country, and that we were building the Chinese Revolution. I hadn't gotten that part of the news until that night, that that's what we were up to. But that story about the openness, and maybe you could unpack that a little bit, why China became so open. Certainly there was tremendous interest. We know about the end of the Qing and foreigners coming in, the American open door, saying equal opportunity for all foreign countries to exploit China, that sort of thing. That part we have some sense of. But what were the forces that produced that openness and that incredible curiosity that you described, where Chinese were going everywhere to learn about other places, to learn about other things, in some cases to bring that knowledge back. But in every instance, to participate in this larger world. And, Frank highlighted every institution the Chinese were participating in, international bodies, not always with success and not always equally, but participating. Can you say something about the forces that brought about that openness and how people used it?
It's a really good question. I haven't really thought about it. What caused it? I remember that you were very kind to mention a book I did on prisons. And of course, that, to me, with hindsight, is the most remarkable achievement. There's no such thing as positive law under the empire. In other words, there will be negative constraints against individuals and groups of people, but nothing to protect your freedom of movement, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, etc., etc.
Red lines, but no assertion of rights.
Exactly, no assertion of rights. But even before the empire collapses, from 1904 onwards, the rule of law is embraced. The Supreme Court is established. Codes are written for commercial, criminal, civil law. A modern court system is established. Corporal punishment is abolished. Modern prisons appear. And this movement continues all the way till 1949. So when I started my research, this is a long time ago, I'm a very old man, I thought this is nothing. This is just paper. These are a few model prisons, as you would see in the People's Republic of China. Once you get inside these prisons, it's just nasty. But I used archives inside China, but of course also the archives that the nationalists took with them to Taiwan. And there were many prisons at many levels. And there were entire provinces that were virtually independent from either Beijing in the early years or Nanjing later on. And they were in no obligation to follow what the Ministry of Justice indicated. But they too wanted to achieve modernity. They too wanted to abide by what they referred to as the highest possible standards of treatment for prisoners as prescribed by the League of Nations. They wanted the best at every level. And it isn't, of course, just central governments and local governments. Ordinary people, for instance, around Changchun, the city I mentioned in 1948, ordinary villagers would try to save money and contribute towards building a local school so that their children could go to a local village school with portraits on the wall of Darwin, Edison, science, technology, knowledge, embrace knowledge. So it wasn't just a government project where the government disappears or is weak. What you see is this welling from below, this thirst to improve one's lot, to discover the world, to join that League of Nations that are modern. And by that, in the 1930s, I don't mean Nazi Germany. I don't mean fascist Italy. No, the models are Switzerland, a federation, the United States, the Netherlands, maybe. So where does that drive come from? That's a very good question. I'm not entirely sure.
And that drive doesn't go away.
No. No.
That the intervening years,
no, exactly.
when the opportunity presents itself, is seized and is acted upon.
Absolutely. For instance, the thirst to just trade, exchange products. The moment you have a command economy after 1949, the moment party cadres tell peasants what they should do, you have the appearance of a black market. It appears again and again and again. Many people during the Great Leap Forward managed to survive because they open black markets and they trade against the whole planned economy. So what I call the silent revolution from 1971 onwards is literally millions and millions of ordinary villagers who go about very quietly undermining the planned economy. That already has a tradition that goes back to 1949. And what they're doing is, in effect, go back to pre-49. When we say The party calls them peasants, Nongmin. I call them villagers, people who live in the countryside. But villagers in China never uniquely only cultivated the land. They had many other activities. For instance, small enterprises make straw hats, make plimsoll shoes, produce umbrellas out of paper. All those traditions were wiped out after 1949. They come back with a vengeance from 1970 onwards and flourish, of course, in the 1980s.
And
till the party climbs down again.
And those Chinese who are not on the mainland don't have that interruption.
No.
And so Hong Kong,
Taiwan,
and Chinese communities throughout Southeast Asia.
Indeed. Indeed.
You made reference just now to whether or not fascist Germany, the example there, that sort of thing. And one of the things, part of the complicated narrative is the notion that the Kuomintang was, when Sun Yat-sen reconstructed it, he was inspired by the Bolshevik example and wanted a party that could do things. And so you had this Leninist idea.
Yes.
And so some narrative in between the two that we just looked at will talk about competing Leninist parties.
Yes.
And suggest that the success of the communists is partly because of Soviet aid and American reluctance, but also because that Leninist party, the Communist Leninist Party, was better at being Leninist.
Well,
how do you assess that? Yeah.
There's no doubt about that. Their enemy brothers both received funding from the Soviet Union. But during the Northern March in 1926, as Chiang Kai-shek tries to unify the country, he realizes how much violence is unleashed in the countryside. He doesn't like it. Many of the Kuomintang officers don't like it. There's one man who relishes it. His name is Mao Zedong. And he writes a report, the Hunan Report, his home province, 1926, 1927. He says, just look at what we can do if we harness that raw power of the peasants and direct it. That's what he does.
And he argues that failure to do that, you will be run over by the...
Yes. Chiang Kai-shek says very clearly we should not become like the enemy. It is Chiang Kai-shek who appoints a man called Zhu Zheng as head of the Judicial Yuan immediately after 1927. And he had imprisoned Zhu Zheng years earlier as a personal enemy, but he realizes that judicial independence is absolutely vital. So what is very clear to me is that the nationalists move away from the Leninist model. Mao persists, and I think that in very different circumstances, the communists would have been nothing but a ragtag army of guerrilla fighters. Had the Red Army not marched into the Republic of China in August 1945, they would have been confined to the countryside in the same way that you still have rebels in the south of the Philippines that have been there for decades. So the story would have been very, very different. So there really is no point, I think, in trying to find the explanation of 49 before 1945. The Nationalist Party took the brunt of the war, while Mao was hiding in the countryside, building up an alternative agrarian state. But even then, he would not have prevailed without massive Soviet help. And there's a war machine that you cannot stop. There is a very interesting document in the archives in Taipei, and it dates from roughly 1950, possibly 1951. It is a top American envoy who speaks to Chiang Kai-shek, and the American says, we find it really difficult to come to terms with those Chinese in North Korea, in Korea. We just can't beat them. Well, Chiang Kai-shek says, oh really? So if you can't beat them, how do you think what do you think we should have done in 1948, 1949? It's very difficult to do when you have an enemy who's just determined at all cost to push through and will starve your cities to death. It's very difficult to fight that. On what basis do you fight a war like that? So that, to me, still remains the key explanation. I may be wrong, of course. And then from 1949 onwards, I think it's very clear. It's very, very clear. You just eliminate everything outside of the party itself. They're very successful at doing it.
There's so much here. And I want to come back to the separation of powers in just a minute. Because, in fact, separation of powers is really popular as an idea among college-age Chinese. Surveys have demonstrated this. Chung Silo and others have written on it. But let's come back to that. And let's stay with 49. And even before 49, in areas under the control of the communists, land reform. And you made reference to land reform. And we associate land reform, it happens in South Korea, it happens in Taiwan, it happens in Japan. And that is associated in part, it's one of the factors producing economic growth. Not so on the Chinese mainland, even though this is by far the largest land reform in human history. But one of the things that you made reference to was these struggle sessions. And then you made reference to it today about disappearing billionaires. Can you say something about the ritual and the mobilization, the critique, and in some cases, the self-critique?
Oh, that's a really difficult one, but the amazing thing is that, of course, you had, as you said very rightly, you had land reform in South Korea, you had land reform in Japan, you had it in Taiwan. Nobody ever died. Why should anyone die? You take the land, you compensate the landowners, who then invest in enterprises and industry. This is what happened in all those countries. So to me, the key to understanding land reform is not to think about land. We have all these narratives from William Hinton and other fellow travelers who tell you how wonderful it was because all these peasants were oppressed and couldn't wait to somehow, in a struggle meeting, suku, a Chinese term for, let go of all their bitterness and anger against these horrible landlords. But what is so interesting when you go and read material in the archives where you have work teams who look at what's happening is that apparently within a very short period of time in the People's Republic, people can command anger on very short notice. It's a general idea that people like Stalin, Mao were great actors. They can hide their feelings. But the truth is, in a very short amount of time, ordinary people in China become excellent actors. If they have to just jump up and denounce a neighbor in the 1950s with land reform, later on during the Cultural Revolution, and show their bitterness, they will do it. And then we'll just sit back and the conversation will continue. They can produce proletarian anger on command. Why? Because if they don't, they will be denounced in turn. Well, that's the ritual. That's the ritual.
Why is the ritual so important? Why have the work team go in and rehearse some of these with select people? Why does the ritual matter?
I think, to me, in particular with land reform, the ritual is important because what you're trying to do as a party member is implicate a majority of people against the murder of a minority. What you're trying to do is make sure that people have blood on their hands even if they don't wish to do so. I mean, in 1948, 1949, when land reform starts in parts of Manchuria, the chances are that the nationalist army might come back. But if all these villagers have participated in these unspeakable crimes, and of course, they will send their sons to participate in the People's Liberation Army. They will be afraid of the return of the Nationalist Party. And sometimes there's a team, a CCTV team, and they made a documentary about a village called Yuanbao, all the way in the north of Manchuria, where land reform was implemented in 1948. And they managed to find the survivors. And when you find out what they did and what for, it's just heartbreaking. There's a man who says, we got a horse. We denounced a neighbor who was no richer than we were, but we were told to denounce that neighbor. That neighbor had a horse, so we got a horse. And then he says, but, you know, we had to share it. So we just got the leg of the horse.
And with that leg,
Separation of powers.
separation of powers.
Very important.
Very important. And I've often thought that if the party were to create a rule of law system,
Yes.
the party sees that as just completely unacceptable.
Yes.
But it could perpetuate the party in power because it would provide for a mechanism to release, because there's a lot of anger that isn't faked.
Yes.
There's a lot of anger that's built up, and for people who are dissatisfied with how they've been treated at the factory, how their land has been taken away, that sort of thing. It gives them a mechanism to voice that complaint that doesn't involve storming the barricades.
Yes. Separation of powers to me is all important. If you asked earlier on what are we to do with all this material, and it strikes me that very often debates about the People's Republic of China, or in fact any part of the world, become very confused. If you say it's communist, then there will be others who say, oh, but it's not really communist, it's capitalist. Oh, but what is capitalism? Is it really capitalist? Or if you talk about democracy, all those who will say, oh, but the United States isn't really democratic. I mean, the president in power didn't really get the majority of the votes. That all becomes very confusing. What do these terms mean? Democracy, capitalism, free markets. So to me, the key is not these terms. To me, the key is a movement towards the separation of powers. You could say, I'm a historian of the 20th century, if I had to explain the history of the entire world in the 20th century, I would say that it falls into two opposite movements. One is an attempt to separate out powers. It is an attempt to have executive, legislative, judicial separation of powers, or at the very least, judicial independence. Is very difficult. It takes time for anyone who would be coming from, let's say, the 16th or the 15th century and arrive on planet Earth, and if you would tell that person, look over here, the state actually abides by court orders, that person would be completely flabbergasted. And then the other movement is towards a concentration of power, a philosophy, a movement that believes that there is no good in separating out powers. You must concentrate it into one party. So it doesn't really matter whether we are talking about fascism under Mussolini or Nazism under Hitler or communism. They are all fundamentally the same in that their expressed desire is to concentrate power into one person and ultimately one committee and ultimately one person. So what we have is a movement towards separation of powers in the first half of the 20th century, then a complete clampdown and concentration of power, and then a slight dilution of it. And the reason why I think that the Communist Party will not separate out powers is simply because it has all the assets. An independent judicial system would mean that you can sue the local provincial governor who's got billions of ill-gotten gains and whose children are studying probably at Stanford. It becomes very difficult. There's no incentive there. There's actually fear. And that's another constant. Fear from 1949 onwards, in particular after the Cultural Revolution. Fear of the people. Fear of that anger. Fear of uprisings with all the paranoia that goes with it. So do I predict an attempt to separate out powers in the PRC? Probably not on their own accord. The hand of the party is everywhere and will not move of its own accord.
You've just used the word that was going to be the center of the next question, paranoia. How is it that a party that has accumulated so much power and has such an extensive reach through the organization department, which one writer has described as the world's largest human resources bureau. It would appoint your school superintendent, your principal, your department leader, all of those sorts of things, every city, all of that kind of thing. How is it, because of your perspective, how is it that power generates such paranoia, that power generates such nervousness about sharing even a little bit of it?
Dictators, because ultimately a dictatorship is always about a dictator. Concentration of power always ends in the hands of one person. You could say that Jiang Zemin shared it. You could say Hu Jintao, Wen Jiabao, whatever the names were, they all look alike with the black hair and the black suits. You might say they collaborated, but ultimately if it's not one person, it'll be two people, a small committee. They always, by definition, move between hubris on the one hand and paranoia on the other. This is true for all dictators. On the one hand, they think they can accomplish what no one else has ever accomplished. The Great Leap Forward would be a good example. On the other hand, there's always this fear that someone will come up and do something to them. And if you think about it, it's very basic psychology. If you make me dictator for one day,
Mistake one.
actually I wouldn't agree. Because what would I be spending say we have a department of history and let's say engineer a coup in which I become the dictator of this department. I would be thinking about you. Are you going to stab me in the back? Are you speaking to one of my enemies? In fact, where are my enemies? They're all flatterers, sycophants. So I can no longer recognize my enemies. And one of the key points of the Cultural Revolution is that Mao sees that very, very well. He pits people against other people because he can't trust anyone, including Zhou Enlai, of course. He sees through him. He's easy enough. He's just a sycophant. But others who claim allegiance, you can't trust anyone. If you are a dictator, you must step down one day. How are you going to do that? You can't. The beauty of democracy is not that you can elect people, it's that you can vote them out. But a dictator's got no way of stepping down. He accumulates enemies and paranoia as a result. And this is replicated at every level. I mean, it's the irony that in a dictatorship, although I did say it ends up in the hands of one dictator, but ultimately you have dictators at every level. Mini dictators. Mini Hitlers, mini Stalins, mini Maos, mini me. Everywhere. They all want to replicate what the man at the top does, the generally man. So that generates a lot of paranoia. In fact, the main business of a dictator is to keep tabs on all those around them, and it's a full-time job.
I was going to push back on some of the economic parts of your story. partly because my own work is at the ground level, and seeing how certain investments, certain leadership capabilities did make a decisive difference. But that's not what I'm going to ask about.
But I would agree.
Oh, okay, yeah. Oh, then no pushback.
I mean, what I was trying to say with the silent revolution is that, of course, ordinary villagers from 1971 just go along doing their main business. But many cadres are quite happy to do this too. There are Yan'an, hallowed ground of the revolution, you know, where Mao retreated during the Second World War. There's a team that visits Yan'an in 1975, I think. They're taken aback, this village. The party cadres never read any instructions from Beijing. There are posters of Lin Biao, the posters of Lin Biao fluttering in the wind.
That should have been down for 4 years.
They should have been down for 4 years. And most of all, these cadres organize a black market. They raise pigs against the state. They sell pork on the black market against state mandates. And then they use the money to buy grain on the black market in order to fulfill their grain procurements to the state. So at every level, people try to defraud the state, quote unquote, including not just local party members, but entire local governments will try to defraud Beijing. Fraud at every level.
And that hasn't changed.
That has not changed.
So my last question, then we'll have time for your questions. And in any case, we'll have time for your questions. And that's to come back to, what are we to do? Because this one-man historical wrecking crew has gone after this story. And so you, in your classrooms, need to cultivate the critical thinking evident in this alternative tale, right? Which is born out of evidence rather than romance. So you mentioned that you sometimes go into, outside just before this talk, that you sometimes go into high school classrooms in Hong Kong, and the students ask tough questions or interesting questions. Maybe you could talk a little bit about how you go about cultivating these skills, that you have worked so hard to win.
You know, I was educated in Switzerland, and one of the first things we were told to do with help in year one at the University of Geneva is go to the local city archives. And I remember having to write a paper on sumptuary laws under Calvin. You know, how much silk can you wear? Not too much, because it doesn't correspond to your social status. So what you can wear, the amount of silk, the amount of clothes you can wear has to do with your status. Very interesting. But what I'm trying to get at is that, of course, I teach too. And I always got so bored in many classes. But when you see how students can be transformed by contact with a primary source, and that's just quite extraordinary. I have prison files, original prison files. You have the photo of the man who gets sent to Xinjiang for 20 years in 1957 because he poured too much fertilizer on a row of carrots. It's a true case. Spends 20 years there, comes back to Shanghai on the day. So it does work. Students see the face of this man and read through this file. Of course, in Hong Kong they can read Chinese. Their faces are just transformed. And this is what I'm trying to say, is that universities, I understand you're not university teachers, but universities have this idea that there should be a hierarchy. You know, you should only work with primary sources once you are a postgraduate student. I would give primary sources to children in kindergartens. Anything. It could be, it doesn't have to be an original. It could be an extract of a memoir. It could be a description of someone who travels through China. It could be anything, and that opens up such a window that's so much more interesting. So I give primary sources to all of my students at every level, and it makes it so much more interesting. The best books written about the Cultural Revolution are not written by academics, they're written by people who went through it, they're memoirs. There's a good dozen you can choose from. And this is true also for the 1950s. And there's an abundance of primary material in the Republican era. So you pick your sources, all you need to do is frame it a little bit, and it's so much more fun going through a text. Somebody who comes alive on paper, who brings back the past. So don't read academic books.
With a few exceptions.
Let me add one qualification when I say don't read academic books. Do you know how many scholarly articles in the humanities get more than one citation? Or let me rephrase it. How many articles published in the humanities, not just China, get no citations? No citations. Have a guess. 5%, 10%, 82% do not get a single citation, which means that academics don't read academic work. So why would anyone else? With all due respect.
So, so that's one of your big takeaways, right? Be part of the 82%. Those are the articles that somebody labored over, worked hard, maybe didn't get tenure as a consequence of, but they produced and had no impact, right? You folks, we know, in fact, employ, Devin was working with a primary source with the group just ahead of this. So we know that you use those primary sources. But Frank has just highlighted one of the real virtues of primary sources, be they book-length memoirs or a single prison file or land reform record, is that, the old line is that 1 million deaths is a statistic. A single death, that's tragic because you see that person has a name, that person has a story, and that's what you get working with some of these materials.
And it must be about people. I mean, there's a trend in among professional historians that you shouldn't really dwell on people. I mean, there must be a theory. You're not even allowed to say this man was short. or that man had a scar on his face, law-reaching Ministry of Public Security. Because it's irrelevant, you see. There's nothing to the theory behind it. But theory kills people. These people already died. What you would want to do is at least have some empathy, not kill them again with a bloody theory. So, and this is particularly tricky with the field of Chinese studies, because from 1949 onwards, that country was closed. That's why we talked about the number of foreigners who were resident there. The country was closed for 3 decades. So what kind of scholar would be attracted by the People's Republic of China if you can't find stuff? As an anthropologist, you can't interview people. As a historian, you can't go to the archives, etc., etc. Well, I guess it must have attracted people who were pretty much attracted by something else. You call it romantic, the romantic vision. This country in particular, the United States of America, has had a long love affair with China. It started with missionaries. There's nothing wrong with loving other people. But make sure you love the right ones.
Well, or have an appreciation for the individual and not the people just in the abstract.
Don't confuse the regime with the people.
Yeah. Friends, we're into the summary up portion of today's activities. We have this great opportunity for your questions. Please, wait for the microphone, and then we'll go back here.
Okay. Thank you. I am a middle school teacher, and every fall I teach a primary source book called Red Scarf Girl. Yeah, it's experience of a woman who actually lives in the Bay Area, Zhang Jili, I believe her name is, and it's her experience of the Cultural Revolution, Chinese Cultural Revolution, and she, in fact, it's her story of when she was in middle school. So it's an actually perfect book to teach to seventh graders. The reason why I came to this, because I'm a language arts teacher, is because every year I fail to prepare the kids to understand what the Cultural Revolution is, what communism is. They just aren't getting it. And even the parents have said to me, well, it's a great book, but my kid just doesn't understand it. He or she is just falling flat, and I can see it. And I'm hoping when we do the lesson planning that, I can get some ideas. But what do you have to say about that?
I understand the difficulty. It's a different planet. We use the same words, but they don't mean the same thing. When you say bank here, it means generally private bank. When you say bank over there, it could mean anything. It generally belongs to a bank that belongs to the state. So there's not going to be a run on the bank. Bank don't go bankrupt. And it goes on and on and on. Things just mean very different things. So the difficulty is that, on the one hand, is extremely simple. And I tried to make it as simple as possible in my talk. I mean, it really is as simple as that. It's just a concentration of power, and the man at the top is concerned about his legacy after the disaster of the Great Leap Forward. And he pits people against other people during the Cultural Revolution. And he stays way above it. It's as simple as that. But on the other hand, it becomes extraordinarily complex once you start looking at the whole detail. And the other issue is that there is very little literature that I would recommend, because the political scientists who worked on the Cultural Revolution make it so extraordinarily complicated where it doesn't have to be. I mean, I don't want to... Nazi Germany, it's reasonably straightforward what happened. Mussolini's reasonably straightforward what happened. This is in the same league. It's not some different planet. It's not some bizarre Chinese thing. It's all reasonably straightforward. What happened under Pol Pot in Cambodia is reasonably straightforward. It's very complex when you start looking at human beings and how they react. But I understand, but the political framework is reasonably straightforward. So the difficulty is to find something that explains that to students. Well, I would recommend 2 articles I wrote for teachers and students, published in a BBC magazine called History Today. And I think it's got one on the Cultural Revolution, and it's got one, I think, on possibly the Great Leap Forward or something else. So there are 2 short articles for them. It's 2-3 pages, tells you what happened. Narrative style's very straightforward. But ultimately, if you don't understand what a one-party state is, that becomes very difficult. So that's the key. To some extent, yes. To some
No, I was just going to say, and the jealousy about power again.
Yes.
Legacy, all of those kinds of things. We have a question back here. And then we'll go over here.
First, I just want to thank you both for spellbinding us with your storytelling from the beginning to the end. My question, I'd like to circle back to what Clay asked about the openness during the Republican era. And specifically, I'm curious about, Frank, your insight on the impact of the Boxer Indemnity Scholarship Program during that 20-year period from, I think it was 2009 to 29. About 1,300 Chinese studied abroad in the US. Quite an extraordinary number for that period of time.
So and just for those who may not be familiar with it, these were money, so that after the Boxer rebellion was suppressed, the participants in that suppression received money. And in the case of the United States, that money went into this fund.
So it was a totally involuntary educational exchange program, but really a very systematic one, and one I think that led to eventually the development of the Fulbright program. But nonetheless, I'm just curious, we know about the stories of very well-known intellectuals, scientists, high government officials that really benefited from that. My question is, do you think that there was a collective national impact that contributed to this idea of openness?
Yes, absolutely. And of course, the Boxer Indemnity Fund used by the United States to promote education of students from China is part of this huge background of friendship between the United States and China. There's a long background there. They were extremely friendly powers, except that somebody forgot to notice after 1949 that they're no longer all that friendly. So that to me is one interesting observation about that, but it doesn't answer your question, which is, did the country as a whole benefit from it? Yes, absolutely, absolutely. That's the discovery I made studying prisons. My prejudice, we all have prejudices. I'm reasonably open-minded. I never do a topic if I think I have the answers, because it would be very boring. Proof is in the book on the Cultural Revolution. I don't claim all that many people died during the Cultural Revolution. In fact, I'm very conservative. I say maybe 1 million. It wasn't about death. It was about loss. It was about trauma. It was about betrayal. But to come back to your question, I'm interested in the sources. And when I spent 3-4 years going through prison archives, I realized that these are not just model prisons set up to impress foreigners. It isn't just 1 or 2 people who go abroad and learn something about law. No, it is profound, and it reaches very far. You have to imagine that by the 1930s, virtually every county head, prefecture head, of which there were about 2,000, had a higher degree from a foreign university, either Japan or Europe or the United States. There were thousands of lawyers who came back. Wang Chonghui was one of the very first to be trained abroad. He produced the first standard English translation of the German criminal code. P.C. Zhang I already mentioned. Others became judges at the Court of International Justice in The Hague. It is far-reaching. It's not just a model prison in every capital city. It is small towns where you see people have been given a legal education and are keen to promote legal reform from the bottom up. And what I say about law could be said about many, many, many other fields of inquiry. Morris Friedman was a sociologist who went to China in 1948, and he concluded that China had one of the best representatives of sociology in the world. There were Americans who would go to China in the 1930s, and they would write back home and say, you know, people here speak better English than in mainland Europe. The people they would meet, government representatives, lawyers, professors in universities, entrepreneurs, they spoke better English than they did in mainland Europe. And the story continues. It's an extraordinary building up of expertise, of knowledge, an accumulation of experience from already 1895 onwards. The first one is Yan Fu. Yan Fu is the first one. One man goes abroad in the 1860s, 70s. Portsmouth, something like that. Anyway, it was the first. Many followed.
Okay, hi.
You'll get to hear a summary tomorrow, but this will be our last question, so we'll need for the question and the answer.
I apologize.
Okay.
Short.
All right. Frank, thanks so much. Again, you being from the University of Hong Kong, I just want to get your perspective on what the Hong Kong story. Again, if we just talk about the modern Hong Kong story is the one that perhaps started in 1997 with the turnover, perhaps the beginning of the umbrella movement, perhaps like somewhere in the middle of the book. And then we are now in the perhaps in the latter section of the book, I just want to kind of like the Hong Kong story now, how this particular chapter is going to end, and also how do you think the book is going to end in terms of the current issues that going on between China, Hong Kong, people Hong Kong and all that. So you've been a Hong Kong watcher, so I just want to get a sense about how this particular chapter, current chapter is going to end, and how the book is going to end.
Yeah, it's a very difficult one because, as I said, Marxists can see the future, but I'm not one of them. I work on the past. Nobody predicted the collapse of the Soviet Union. Not one single Soviet expert predicted it. Not one of my colleagues at the Hoover Institution at the time predicted the fall of the Soviet Union. When a man in Tunisia set himself on fire, nobody predicted that that would be the fall of a whole series of dictators in the north of Africa. You simply don't know what's going to happen. But one thing is for sure, Hong Kongers are a pretty riotous bunch. What are Hong Kongers? They are nothing but layers and layers of refugees. They came before the Second World War. They came before so-called liberation in 49. They came in the first years of the People's Republic, during the Great Leap Forward, during the Cultural Revolution, during 79, during Tiananmen Square. It's a city of refugees. They know how the mainland was quite well. And they seem to me fearless, and so very disciplined too. All this violence we've seen does not come from any of these protesters. You could say that they rammed LegCo, the Legislative Council. They did that with military precision, unlike the police who were swatting left, right, and center. They left money behind for the drinks they took. They left a few slogans, which I think were very eloquent. One of them says, you taught us that peaceful demonstrations don't work. And still they are very peaceful. How will it end? We don't know. You can't predict that. But never underestimate the resilience of ordinary people. Here's something very different. You asked me to be short. Shanghai. Mao complained about cities to Pol Pot. Said, you just can't get rid of all those bourgeois elements in cities. Pol Pot, first thing he did, empty the cities. Mao couldn't get rid of all that subversion in Shanghai. Shanghai still remains a rather subversive city, and that's after 70 years of communism. So good luck with Hong Kong.
Good luck with Hong Kong. Good luck to Hong Kong. We want the best for the people there.
Absolutely.
I just want to confess, I am so jealous of this man's learning, of his storytelling, and I'm jealous of his students. And I feel really lucky to have been among his students today. Do you feel that way?
You're very kind. You're very kind. Thank you. Thank you.